It's well understood that games like Dungeons & Dragons and other fantasy role-playing games derive from a wide plethora of sources, from J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings or the novels of Jack Vance. Today, I'm bringing you 3 short stories that you can read really quickly to draw a bunch of inspiration from, whether it be to enhance your descriptive power for your scenes, or, as a player, give you new perspectives on decision making during gameplay. Howdy y'all, welcome to Nashcraft with Brady. Today I'm going to be providing you 3 short stories that you can probably find for free on the internet right now with the Google search. Short stories are a great way to read something really quickly and feel satisfied for completion, but if it's written really well, then they're really chock full of ideas and inspiration. First on the list today, we have The Tale of Satampra Zeiros by Clark Ashton Smith. Clark Ashton Smith is actually a contemporary of those like Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard, and if anything, the best way I could describe him is if you kind of took Robert E. Howard, the writer of Conan, and Lovecraft and kind of smashed them together. And The Tale of Satampra Zeiros is sort of a found documentary, found footage type of story where you're reading the manuscript of an adventurer who's probably bleeding out and dead by the time maybe you're reading this. But it's the perfect kind of story to have a primer for a game like Shadowdark, set in a grimdark world. And instead of someone like Conan the Barbarian, where maybe he's like a successful level 10 character, this story kind of has you following some level 1 dorks. It opens up with 2 thieves who have just had a successful heist, and instead of buying some food, they decide to buy a drink to hopefully inspire their next round of heists. And sure enough, they decide to head off into the jungle to some forbidden, supposedly allegedly cursed place to steal some jewels or steal some treasure. And of course, horrific character death is met. It is just a wonderful, quick story that you can read that just conjures up this sort of gloomy mood, but this also sort of like grimdark, sardonic, black humor, essentially, of these 2 ne'er-do-wells that essentially, as they're robbing from the poor country folk along the side for their meals before they head off into the jungle to try to do their. And of course, all they did with the last treasure's profit is sell it for drinks. So like I said, this is a perfect sort of primer for a Shadowdark game that is all about fetching treasure and then going and spending it on carousing. My second recommendation would be the Saga of the Volsungs, and today we're going to be talking specifically about Sigurd and his slaying of the dragon Fafnir. It's the classic tale of the hero slaying the dragon and taking his treasure hoard. And although there's not much of a descriptive battle scene per se, you do get some interesting exposition dump and lore dump from this dying dragon that Sigurd has slayed, Fafnir. And Fafnir the dragon himself actually did not start out as a dragon. He was actually corrupted and eventually took on the form of a worm or a dragon, which is kind of an interesting backstory to dive into. Interesting concept, kind of reminds me of Dark Suns a little bit. And in this story, after Sigurd eats a little bit or tastes a little bit of Fafnir's roasted heart, he's able to speak to birds. So that's your next quest, that characters can now slay a dragon and consume their hearts. That way they can talk to the penguin folk and negotiate a truce. And here's the description of Sigurd raiding the cave of Fafnir. Sigurd rode along Fafnir's trail to his lair and found it open. The gateposts were of iron, and the gates of iron too, were all the beams in the house, which was dug down into the earth. There Sigurd found a mighty store of gold, and he filled 2 chests full thereof. He took the fear helm, the Aegis helm, and a golden mailcoat, and the sword Hroti, and many other precious things. So now we can clearly see where a lot of these motifs of something like The Hobbit was drawing from, this sort of raiding the dragon's lair for a bunch of treasure. And the rest of the Volsungs saga is highly fascinating, including tons of interesting names and concepts, including the sword that Sigurd uses to slay Fafnir, a sword called Glam, as described as all decked with gold and gleaming bright. And this sword was actually given first to Sigurd's father, Sigmund, who was actually given to it by Odin in a fascinating exchange. During a feast in the hall of King Volsung, quote, a man came into the hall. He was not known to the men by sight. He was dressed in this way. He wore a mottled cape that was hooded. He was barefoot and had linen breeches tied around his legs. And as he walked up to Barnstock, he held a sword in his hand, while over his head was a low-hanging hood. He was very tall and gray with age, and only had 1 eye. He brandished the sword and thrust it into the trunk, so that it sank up to the hilt. Words of welcome failed everyone. Then the man spoke. He who draws this sword out of the trunk shall receive it from me as a gift. and then himself shall prove that he was never carried a better sword than this one. Then the old man walked out of the hall. Nobody knew who he was or where he went. Eventually, only the son of King Volsungs, Sigmund, is able to draw the sword out of the tree put there by this wanderer, Odin. Does this sort of sound familiar? Maybe a little bit of drawing a sword out of a stone, perhaps? Although I think drawing a sword out of a tree, specifically put there by a god, is a highly provocative twist on this, if not, an originator of this tale in some regards. And eventually, even this sword Glam will be broken again by Odin before it reaches Sigurd, and the sword will eventually be reforged for Sigurd before he's able to use it to slay Fafnir. And does this sort of reforging of ancient broken swords remind you of another famous tale, maybe? Very quick read. You can find lots of interesting analysis online. Highly recommend you check it out. And last but not least, we could not finish this list without a mention of Robert E. Howard. And specifically, the story that I want to talk about is The Devil in Iron. And aside from the amazing battle language that Howard always employs, things like his swords swing their death songs, just great stuff. If you want to get really good at describing battle scenes, I would highly recommend picking this up. Howard's father was a surgeon in Texas, and so he saw lots of gore probably growing up in his household, which is why I gave him such a good vocabulary and well of experience to draw from when writing these sorts of scenes. So really, really good stuff if you're really to get into the sort of hack and slash and slice and dice sort of vernacular. But the reason that I'm picking this story in specific is I want to highlight the way that Conan deals with some of the insurmountable odds he is faced with. In this story, this ancient demigod or demon thing has taken on this form of this sort of larger man-like creature that looks like man but also has like the color and components of iron. And Conan is quickly realizing that his regular sword, is not doing anything against this foe. So imagine, this guy's like AC 20 and resistance to all physical damage. In that twilight chamber, it was as if a man fought with a dream monster in a nightmare. Flinging down his useless sword, Conan caught up with a heavy bench and hurled it with all his power. It was such a missile as few men could even lift, and Khosatral's mighty breast it smashed into shreds and splinters. It did not even shake the giant on his braced legs. His face lost something of its human aspect. A nimbus of fire played about with his awesome head, and like a moving tower he came on. With a desperate wrench, Conan ripped a whole section of tapestry from the wall. Whirling it, with a muscular effort greater than that required for throwing the bench, he flung it over the giant's head. For an instant, Khosatral floundered, smothered and blinded by the clinging stuff that resisted his strength as wood or steel could not have done, and in that instant, Conan caught up his scimitar and shot out into the corridor. Without checking his speed, he hurled himself through the door of the adjoining chamber, slammed the door, and shot the bolt. And I just love this. It's so amazing that, yes, imagine you're fighting this foe that literally, his sword is breaking and literally not doing anything against this, and so he's thinking on his feet, and it's the little mundane details of the scene that Conan is able to sort of interact with and use to his advantage. I was kind of thinking it was like a Jackie Chan sort of type move. So, yeah, this thing is coming after him. There's nothing he can do, but he realizes that, he's got, this thing has eyes, and so he quickly throws this drapes that are just hanging right here in this stairwell that he's at or whatever, and blinds, and, buys him just a little bit of time to escape out of that scene instead of just endlessly trying to hack at the same thing over and over again. It reminds me of this one story from a Vaults of Varn campaign session where a bunch of players were fighting this blue worm thing in some sort of like sand pit, and it had a very high AC, and everyone's just taking turns just trying to shoot at it. Shoot at the AC, shoot at the AC, I just try to shoot it at a high AC and no one's really making contact with it. And my little brother-in-law noticed that we were in a cave and asked, hey, are there little stalactites hanging from the ceiling? And I said yes. And his idea was to go ahead and to shoot those, to make those rain down on top of the worm. And that was such a perfect encapsulation of ways of thinking outside the box and thinking of what is involved with this environment and how can we use it as an edge over a difficult enemy that seems to have a particular resistance or way of impeding our normal ways instead of just trying to just roll an attack action every time. So I think this is not only a good exercise for players and how you can think about what your character sees in their environment and what sort of advantage that you can create for yourself, even if it's just buying some time or maybe finding clever ways of dealing damage outside of just your normal hit the attack button. And for GMs, it's also important that we provide those opportunities, and sometimes those mundane items actually might be a lot more impactful than we might realize. And together with collaborative players and GMs, we can have really amazing scenes like these. So check out some of these short stories if you haven't already. Pretty sure you can find them online for free. And then share down in the comments down below what you're reading for inspiration. Thanks everyone, and keep crafting.